Hey guys, Ms. Osborne back again with another video. Today we're going to be talking about the Russian Revolution and the end of World War I. There was a big social unrest in Russia that kind of pushed them to the edge of revolution with the Tsar. The events kind of led to the exit of Russia from the war and became a major turning point, especially because they had to pull out of the war. The United States had entered because of this, and this kind of led the Allied powers to victory and then peace afterwards. The essential standards we're going to be covering during this video are 7.3 and 8.1. Golden Hawk historians will evaluate the extent to which the collapse of a government or nation causes changes in the balance of power within a region and between nations, and explain how the conditions and agreements resulted from one conflict may serve as a catalyst for greater conflicts when ongoing problems are not resolved effectively. So while you're watching, make sure that you're taking notes in either outlined format, as we've talked about in class, and that you may need to pause or rewind the video to make sure that you're taking good notes and you understand all the information as we go. So during World War I, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia had promised a whole bunch of change, and the change hadn't really been seen. So a group called the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, tried to overthrow the Tsar and try to give the people back the power. Lenin ruled under socialism, which was a social dynamic kind of decided in the early 1900s, and he wanted an elite group to lead the revolution, but also allowing the people to keep as much power as possible. However, Tsar Nicholas had hoped that the World War would help to unite the country because of the different ways that they were coming together to create different war supplies and that patriotism that comes along with a war effort. But the factories weren't able to produce enough of those supplies, and so the military wasn't able to fight or prepared to fight. And so most of the patriotism that would have been felt because of the war wasn't felt at all because men were dying left and right. They lost a lot of battles. They lost a lot of soldiers. They weren't able to produce enough food. And so the economic situation worsened, and a famine kind of took over Russia. On March 8th, the Russian citizens took to the streets and they started the Russian Revolution. They were protesting a lack of fuel, a lack of food, all these things that were going toward the war effort. However, they weren't seeing any benefits of this in the war. Tsar Nicholas II, in emergency order, tried to disband the Russian legislature because he wanted to make sure that he had all the power, but they refused. The legislature was the only place in which the Russian people had any sort of power, and so they wanted to make sure that they had that power and that they were keeping the people's purposes within the government. With the people, the military, and the legislature refusing to listen to the Tsar, it was clear that his monarchy was over and he was dethroned. A provisional government was put into place called the Duma, but the Russian people didn't really feel like there was a lot being done to meet their needs, and they started hearing from the socialist rhetoric from the Bolsheviks about how the people should be the ones that have the power, that the people should be the ones who are benefiting from the government, and so they actually started to support the Bolsheviks, and they were able to put a provisional government into place instead during the October Revolution, which was led by the Bolshevik Red Guard. They started to lead this revolution against the provisional government, but Lenin was quickly able to take over. He established a communist government, he made private ownership of land illegal, and he took control of Russia's factory system in an effort to try to make it more effective. After the revolution was over, Russia's involvement in World War I ended because they had to leave World War I in order to make sure that they were taking care of their own situation before they were entering into a different situation. But they had to accept really harsh terms of surrender. They had to give up a large chunk of its empire in the Western Europe, which we'll kind of talk about when we get to World War II. The acceptance of those terms upset a lot of Russians who felt like they got the sore end of the deal, and they felt like the Bolsheviks had kind of shorted the Russians, and so they created an opposition movement to the Bolsheviks called the White Army. The Whites were pretty much made up of previous people who had benefited from the Russian government and the Russian nobles, the army leaders, politicians who had kind of worked with the Tsar, and they were also able to receive help from the Bolsheviks' enemies, the United States and France. The United States and France were the Bolsheviks' enemies because they were capitalist, and capitalist and communist nations were constantly not happy with one another. They were at odds because of their economic principles. So as a result of the Civil War and the famine that had been happening during the early parts of World War I, there was a lot of really poor Russians, and so Lenin tried to introduce a new economic policy that tried to allow some capitalist activity, because his communist plans that kind of dictated the factory system, the food production, weren't working, and so he started to allow people to sell food for a profit, trying to encourage more food production. Following World War I, Russia was able to join with several neighboring lands that had previously been a part of the Russian Empire in Eastern Europe, and those countries formed what's known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union. All of these countries in Eastern Europe were overall communist. So when the Russians pulled out, the United States went ahead and entered the World War I in order to help the Allied powers, because they had been on the side of the Allies previously. America had, for the most part, remained neutral, but that's not really that easy when unrestricted warfare is happening in that area. So the German U-boats, aka the submarines that were browsing the Atlantic, they were carrying out this unrestricted warfare, saying that they were going to attack any sort of ship that was traveling to any power that they were at war with, which predominantly for us was Great Britain. Great Britain was one of our greatest allies, and we were providing them weaponry, trying to make sure that they had those supplies that they needed, even though we weren't technically a part of the war. One of the American ships, the Lusitania, was sunk, which killed 1,200 people, including 120 Americans. And America said, please, 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 don't sink any more ships. Germany agreed. But there was still some other conflicts there. The Zimmermann Note was signed by a German diplomat and sent to Mexico, and was discovered by the United States. And it essentially said that any of the properties that the United States had taken from the Mexicans during the Mexican-American War back in the early 1800s would be given back to Mexico if Mexico came in on the side of the Germans in this battle. And so that was kind of the last straw, and the United States decided to join the Allied powers. Germany had previously known that the United States joining the Allied powers would lead to a quick win. The United States had a very vast military. They were one of the largest industrial powers in the entire world, and so they wanted to make sure that they needed to act before they could even mobilize, before the United States even entered the war in Europe. With Russia predominantly out of the way, the German strategy of focusing on both fronts, they were able to push back out of the Western Front and kind of leave Russia alone, and then they focused instead on the Western Front going into Paris. The Second Battle of the Marne was when the United States kind of helped out with that, and they were able to push the Germans all the way back to Berlin and switch to the offensive, because previously to this, the Americans had been on the defensive, the Allies had been at the defensive, and so this was a very decisive win for them. In October of 1917, the Allied forces were able to push through the German lines, and they convinced the Germans to accept an armistice or a truce until they were able to put together a treaty. So when the different four powers came together, Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of the United States, he was predominantly the one leading the peace conference. And he came to the peace conference with a plan called the 14 points. The first 4 points talked about open diplomacy between countries, so this idea that they should be able to have conversations with one another about what they wanted to have, freedom of the seas, which really tried to address the unrestricted submarine warfare, removal of any sort of trade barricades that was kind of benefiting one country versus another, and then the reduction of military arms, which went ahead and addressed the whole cause of militarism and how all of these countries had large standing armies that created tensions between the countries. The fifth point proposed a system to resolve any sort of disputes over colonies, trying to make sure that they were addressing the issues over imperialism. Points 6 through 13 dealt with self-determination, which was essentially like people being able to decide their own political status. This was predominantly talking about the minority groups in Europe, but also some of the colonies that were starting to gain independence. And then the 14th point, which was the most important point, tried to establish a League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations. The whole purpose of it was to protect democracy and prevent any sort of future wars. It was kind of like the United Nations, but they didn't have as much power. Also, the United States was not a part of the League of Nations, which greatly weakened it and ultimately would lead to its ineffectiveness. So the big four countries were the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy, and they were essentially the winners. Germany and any of the Central Powers were not invited to the peace conference. Every nation came to the conference with different needs and expectations. France wanted Germany to pay. They wanted more land. Great Britain wanted more land. And effectively, these four powers created the Treaty of Versailles. There was three main changes that were included in the Treaty of Versailles. The military was one of them. They wanted Germany to disarm completely their military. So they wanted to effectively take away any of Germany's power to defend itself or to launch another war. And so they limited the size of their army. They banned them from having an air force. The territory also changed. So Germany had to give land to France, specifically the territory of Alsace-Lorraine, which was one of the most industrialized pieces of Germany up in the top corner where Germany and France border one another. They also had to give up control of their colonies, so they no longer were an imperial power. Any new countries and colonies that had formed in Europe and the Middle East were now looked at during the Treaty of Versailles. The war guilt provisions also were really embarrassing for Germany because they had to take the sole responsibility of the war. And because of that, they had to pay reparations, which essentially was like saying, like, here's what you owe me because you bombed the city and everything's ruined. And it also established the League of Nations, which, again, we talked about didn't work. There was three main effects of the war: political, economic, and human. Politically, this was the end of monarchies in Europe. So the monarchies were effectively over. Legislatures started to begin. Most of those monarchs became head figures rather than actual political leaders. The Bolsheviks and the communists in Russia really started to rise, and now this was a new thing for the world to contend with. Germany was weakened economically, it was weakened politically. They went from being one of the world leaders to now being at the very bottom of the food chain. There was also a lot of new countries and colonies in Europe and the Middle East because of the war and the changing of different country lines. The European colonies in Africa and Asia also changed hands as a result of who won and who lost World War I. Economically, the world cost of the war was $332 billion. Farmland and cities were just devastated, and so Europe is going to enter into a major economic depression. About 8.5 million soldiers overall died. This was pretty much an entire generation of young men. Entire cities were wiped out during this war. About 13 million civilians died, and 21.2 million soldiers were wounded, and so this would greatly affect the healthcare systems of Europe. So now this is the end of the video, so make sure that you read back over your notes. You have all the necessary vocabulary, and I look forward to seeing you in class.